This video is about a less-known phenomenon seen in medieval Chinese manuscripts, namely the so-called joined graphs or hewen, which combine two characters into a single unit and are read as two syllables. Early Chinese manuscripts and inscriptions often make use of two devices, referred to by modern researchers as hewen, that is ligature or joined graphs, and chongwen, that is duplication. Both of them are marked with the same mark, comprising these two dashes that are placed below the lower right corner of the character. So this mark resembles the character to R, but sometimes it's written in a more cursive way, joining the two of them together. So it's not quite clear whether it really comes from the word to. So, for example, here we have a shard from the so-called Homa covenant texts, the Homa Mengshu. So these are texts from about 490 BC. They're very early, and they're written on stone plaques. And they're basically oaths sworn by vassals to a lord. So this is kind of the end of the Chunqiu and the beginning of the Warring States period. And on this little shard that contains only a few characters, we see three examples of these joined graphs. This is one of them, and it writes the name of the city of Handan. And you can see that the two graphs are basically joined into one, and this is indicated by these two strokes placed underneath of them. So these two strokes tell us that we shouldn't read this character by itself, but they should be read as Handan. And then another example is Zisun, so as sons and grandsons, that is descendants. And actually what we see here is just the character sun, so grandsons, but because sun already includes the character zi in it. So it's possible to just place these two lines underneath to indicate that this graph here stands for both characters and should be read as zisun. And we can see that the same joined graph occurs on this little shard two more times. So once it's here, and then once it's here. This is only partially visible, but the text is very formulaic, so we know what comes before it. What is more interesting, or what I really want to talk about today, is that these kinds of joined graphs appear also in medieval manuscripts written on paper, more specifically in Buddhist texts. So this is a manuscript from the Paleo collection in Paris, P2133, and it is written in this semi-cursive script. So there are lots of interesting characters because of the cursive nature of the hand. And so, for example, we have these joined graphs such as these. They're two examples of the same word. Actually, in this case, it's a name. If you don't know these joined graphs, or you don't understand them, you haven't seen them before, or you haven't learned them, then you can't read them. It's basically the name of the disciple Subhuti. And Subhuti is written in Chinese as Shuputi. And then, for example, you have the first character Shu, and then after it, Pu and Ti are written together into a single graph using two grass radicals together. In example B here, you see that the same Shu graph is written in a cursive way. So again, if you don't know that it's written this way, then it's hard to recognize it. But this is not in itself a joined graph, it's just a cursive way of writing Shu. But then underneath it, we see again the same joined graph for the characters Puti. Puti, of course, means Bodhi, enlightenment. And so that's why there's a joined graph for this one word. And this is different from the Sanskrit version of the name where the word Bodhi is not in it. Subhuti basically doesn't contain the word Bodhi, but in Chinese it does. And so here there are other examples. They're very similar. The difference is only in the level of cursiveness to them. And also that this component Bodhi or Puti is written with a dot underneath. So in this case, in example D, it's written with a dot in the middle. And actually, when written on its own, this joined graph is usually written that way. So in general terms, there are three words that are typically written in Chinese Buddhist texts with this kind of joined graph. So the second one is the word Puti or Bodhi, meaning enlightenment, which we saw just earlier in the name of Subhuti or Shuputi, and it's usually written with the dot in the middle. The reason for that is that without the dot, This joint graph usually denotes the word Pusa, that is Bodhisattva. And it's quite easy to see how this graph came into being. Basically, what we see is two grass radicals, and that could be seen as an abbreviation of the characters for Pusa. So they only took the top part of each of these graphs, and together they used them to denote the word Bodhisattva. In the case of Puti, to differentiate from Bodhisattva, they added a dot. But as we've seen in the previous example, that was not always the case, probably because quite often the context made it quite obvious what the graph meant to denote. And occasionally you also see this other version of writing this word, and this is this way. So again, this is an abbreviation. It's basically the character T with a grass radical on the top, which is the abbreviation of the first character here, Puti. And then the third word that's written quite commonly like this is the word Nieppan for nirvana. And in that case, we see this character, which by itself would usually mean 40, so that it's pronounced Si. But then when you put the two of them together, then they denote the word Nieppan, that is nirvana. But other than these three words, there are actually quite a few other ones that occasionally appear as joint graphs. So, for example, here we see the word 功德, merit, written in this joint way. These joint graphs typically lack some components, so they also function as an abbreviation. And in this case, we're missing the left-hand component of the second character, of de, and then there's this long stroke that joins the two of them together. And then here's another word for the Sanskrit word svaha. And so in this case, the two characters are just written closely together, so they look more like a single character. And here's another example for the word acharya, teacher, and the Chinese word is sheli, and then they're written together and also in a kind of cursive way, abbreviating part of the character. Now, another example is the word for tathagata, Rulai, and in this case, it's kind of more like an abbreviation because the context makes it very clear what the character is. And so it's possible to write it this way. So the second character is basically only marked. It's not written out. Another example is fannao, vexation. And here, again, we see this kind of abbreviation of the second character. And again, there's an example of the word 功德, where the second character is abbreviated to the point of just being marked. And these few examples here, they are all examples of the word 佛子, so son of the Buddha. And these appear occasionally written as separate characters and sometimes clearly written together as a single graph. We can see them in action, in their context, and you can see quite clearly that, for example, here, the two graphs are written as one graph, obviously because they function as a single semantic unit, even though they consist of two syllables. And finally, I also wanted to mention that there is this way of writing certain names. So one example is the surname Linghu, which is a double surname consisting of two characters. And this surname appears in Dunhuang quite frequently from early on. You can see the dates here. So this is from the beginning of the 6th century. And this person is Linghu Chongzhe. He's overseeing the copying of sutras. And his name is written in a normal way. The two characters are written separately as any other two characters. And we see a similar thing in the second example. But then, from the early 9th century, we have an example when the two characters of the double surname Linghu are written as a single graph. And again, if you haven't seen this or haven't learned about it, you probably will not be able to recognize this surname. And then there are several examples of this, also typically from the 9th century or maybe from the 10th century. So this surname becomes written in this joint way quite often. Here's another really interesting example. This is from manuscript S238, which is a Taoist manuscript. And here on the left, you have this name Yuanfu, written as a joint graph. Interestingly, before that, you have an empty space, which is a form of respect, so they put it in front of the name of the master. And in this example, the first character is yuan, which is written on the right-hand side, and the second is fu. So both characters are written out in full, but they're squeezed together into a single graph. And then in the second example from the same manuscript, you have the name Yinjing. And in this case, there's an abbreviation because the left side of the character yin is missing. And so it makes it possible to join the characters together into a tighter unit. And maybe unrelated to this is this habit in letters to write one's own name in smaller script and joining the two characters together. So here you have a letter written by Guiwen and Quande, and they write the whole letter in a certain script, but when adding their own names, they write them in small and squeeze the characters together. So this is technically maybe a different kind of practice, but when you see them on a page, these characters kind of give the impression of being single graphs. Okay, so these are the examples that I wanted to show. They're interesting because Chinese characters are typically written out as separate entities on the page, and they're not usually linked together, but there are a few examples that do this. Okay, I hope this was useful. Thank you for watching and hope to see you next time.